So hello and good afternoon. We'll get started. Thank you very much for being here, so many of you, in the presentation of this amazing book, The World After Gaza, published by Galaxium Gutenberg, with whom we have organized this session together. I would like to warmly thank the Galaxia team for this amazing joint partnership. For us, it is an honor and a pleasure to host again Pankaj Mishra, a dear friend at the CCCB. He came here more than 20 years ago, thanks to Julie Ward, who is also here. So he came here for the first time at the Cosmopolis in 2002, and he's been a frequent visitor. He is one of the most clever intellectuals of the contemporary world, and he has just published a book which seems timely, yet it's a long regard on the current world, based on an analysis of the current conflict in Gaza. I speak in Catalan because they both kind of understand Catalan, even if they hide it. Ben Ehrenreich is a North American journalist based in Barcelona. He's also an amazing writer. He has an amazing book on his journalistic essays in the West Bank. He knows the region very well, and he's a dear friend of Pankaj, and this is why he has very kindly accepted to be here.
And for your long work and friendship.
Pankaj, it's a delight to be here with you. I want to. The first question I have for you is actually a good way for us to appreciate the CCCB, in contrast to certain other institutions of high culture. For instance, I thought I'd start by asking you to talk a bit about the origin of this book, which began as a talk you were going to give at the Barbican Centre in London in February of 2024, if I'm right, as part of the a lecture series organized by the London Review of Books, and which was abruptly cancelled after the Barbican learned the title of your talk, which was then The Shoah After Gaza. And so I wonder if you can talk a bit about that, in the context of the broader regime of silencing and censorship, which started long before October 7th, and which you had some familiarity with already, but which certainly, I think, probably confirmed a lot of the ideas and echoed a lot of the ideas that you were already working with in that talk, and then apparently motivated you to expand that talk into something broader.
Thank you, Ben, and it's a great honor to be talking to you, to someone who's actually reported and written about this subject with great clarity and passion for a long time. And I've personally learned a great deal from your work. So it's really wonderful to be able to talk to you about this. And thank you, Judith, for arranging this, and thank you all for coming this evening. As you say, I think if you want to write about this subject, in, let's say, when I first started off as a writer, it's something that interested me, partly because of certain reasons I can explain, certain sort of quirks of my personal biography. I grew up in India in a family of Hindu nationalists who were very attached to the state of Israel. We can talk a little bit about that. But because of that reason, I always wanted to engage with this subject in a sustained way. But when I first tried to make that attempt with the Western periodicals I used to write for, including the New York Times Magazine, I certainly found the doors were shut, that there was absolutely no encouragement. In fact, there was a very flat denial that no, we've got people working on this, and so similar things happened with other places. Mind you, I was constantly writing at these places about a range of subjects. I could go to China and write about Chinese intellectuals or Chinese dissidents. I could go to Indonesia. I could go anywhere in the world really and write about this. But this subject was close to me. And certain people were basically allocated their sort of, this particular task of writing about them. So as you say, I was very aware of this regime of censorship and suppression over a long period. And of course, at the same time, there were no Palestinian or Arab voices in the Western media on this subject. The only one was Edward Said, and I know from personal experience of these places that even at the more liberal periodicals like the New York Review of Books, there was a prohibition on him writing about Palestine. He could write about music, he could write about Egyptian novels, but because Isaiah Berlin did not like him, so Edward Said could not write for the New York Review of Books on Palestine. So there are all kinds of prohibitions in place. So when I came to contemplate this piece for the LRB, which was a winter lecture, part of their series of winter lectures, the onslaught on Gaza had already kind of taken a very clear complexion, and that was of mass extermination. And I started to think about the legitimacy of the State of Israel, which is very much grounded in a certain memory of the Holocaust. And it became clear to me that that memory will not survive the Israeli onslaught, and that we will have to think very differently about this narrative of the Holocaust that the Israelis have used to justify their expansion, justify their violence. And so I came up with the title, The Show After Gaza, which is a way to think about, how we will look at this extraordinary act of political evil in the light of what the Israeli regime is doing to Gaza. The title was enough to scare the organizers at the Barbican.
They didn't see the text.
Not a word of it. I had not written it at that stage. And they told the LRB had already, the London Review of Books had already advertised the lecture in their pages. And then I got an email from the editor saying, you won't be probably surprised to hear that they pulled out. And we are looking for another venue. This was only 3-4 weeks before the actual lecture. So they found another venue eventually. But, again, I don't want to dwell too much on this incident because I know people have faced much harsher, much more draconian regimes of censorship and suppression. People have lost jobs for liking an Instagram post. I went to Canada and came across a curator who was previously celebrated in the New York Times as the most influential curator of indigenous arts in North America. She suddenly found herself one day faced with the museum director who said, here is, NDA, and here is a big severance package. And she basically disappeared for 6 months. Now she's back in public life, all because she had liked a post on Instagram that was calling for the Palestinian rights to be respected. So there are many, many instances of, this kind of suppression and this kind of dissent. And of course, today, we see in Germany, we see in the United States, a much more brutal crackdown, which is resorting to, the most extreme sort of measures. Measures that are striking at the foundation of these countries' democracy, their constitutions. So this is a much more disturbing phase.
This next is less a question than a prompt, so I hope you'll run with it. And which is that this book strikes me, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it's really of being written from a place of deep despair, and I think it's a despair that probably a lot of us in this room are familiar with, of not just of the genocide itself and the barrage of, in the last 24 hours, more than 100 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. It's been more than 1,100, I think, since the ceasefire ended. And if you're on social media, you see the images all day long. But not just that, but the incredible failure of virtually every institution in public life in the West to not only to respond, but not to abet and not to silence to continue this, and a deeper failure of the values that the West has vaunted for so long. I'm going to quote you. You wrote that the genocide reveals, quote, a decrepit world which no longer has any belief in itself, tramples freely on the rights and principles it once held sacred, and rewards violence, lies, cruelty, and servility. So I wonder if you could just expand on this. The subject of this book is less Gaza itself than parsing these reactions and failures to react to this genocide that's right in front of us.
Yes, I mean, I think, again, I mean, as the war continued and became more ferocious, it became clear to me that this is really a turning point in the moral history of the world, in the political history of the world, in the geopolitical history of the world, and that things will never be the same again. That we've embarked upon a dark new phase in modern history. And nothing that has happened since then, including Trump's election, has surprised me. Because I think this incident really was a culmination, this atrocity in Gaza was a culmination of several tendencies that had been forming for some time. And I think the best way to define those tendencies is to group them under the rubric of nihilism. What the piece that you read out, where you freely violate the principles you upheld just a little while ago, that you were trying to export to the rest of the world, exporting democracy, exporting civilized values to various parts of the world and saying, this is what you should do in order to become more like us. And here you are, supervising the destruction of hospitals, churches, schools, killings of children. I could tell that the moral legitimacy built for a certain idea of the West, of the democratic West, would be completely destroyed by this. Not only that, the violence that was being unleashed in Gaza was going to come home in the most monstrous forms. And that the violence being suffered by the Palestinians today would manifest itself in all kinds of brutalities in the very countries that are right now supporting Israel. And that is what we see happening in real time today. So, I think, not to dwell on this too much, in a variety of ways, this was a landmark atrocity that, just in the way I keep saying the Spanish Civil War was, where the democracies did not come to help Spain, where some of the world's worst regimes were involved in the destruction of Spain, including Mussolini and Hitler's regimes. I think Gaza is very likely to be remembered in the same way.
Speaking of some of the world's worst regimes, Netanyahu today is in Hungary, spending time with Orban. And some of so much of what's happening in the news today is twists the head around. So here we have the leader of the Jewish state visiting the most outspoken and obvious anti-Semitic leader in the world today, who is ignoring a warrant from the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity committed by Netanyahu and the Jewish state, and actually takes the opportunity to withdraw from the ICC with his presence there. And one of the reasons these things are so dizzying is we have this narrative which presents Israel as overlapping with the Holocaust. And we have this understanding of Israel as the state that emerged out of the trauma of the Holocaust to make sure it wouldn't happen again, to protect the Jewish people, and that has sort of gained a sort of absolute hold on that memory and on the demand that it imposes on the world to prevent this from happening again, right? And what I think a lot of people don't know, and which you really lay out, I think, quite masterfully in the first section of the book, is how this memory was constructed. And in order to create a collective identity in Israel, and I wonder if you can just sort of take us through that.
I think one way to approach this subject is to think about how individual memory is transmitted. If you suffer a traumatic event, you obviously feel it in your mind, your heart, your soul. You are damaged, perhaps, in a very significant way. And at some point you overcome that damage, or maybe you don't. Maybe you transmit some of that trauma and suffering to the next generation or to the following generation. But collective memory doesn't spring organically out of an event. Collective memory is something very deliberately created to serve particular ideological and political ends. And that was the case. And mind you, the memory of the Holocaust is not the only such memory to be cultivated, developed, and instrumentalized. There are other narratives too. But this is the most prominent and perhaps the most world historical case of a collective memory of an extraordinary atrocity turned into, in the first instance, as a kind of political strategy for far-right politicians in Israel. That's how it started. We can now create this narrative to create essentially to form another sort of national community in the 1960s. From the 1960s onwards, that was the attempt by Israeli politicians on the right. Before that, they were indifferent to the Holocaust. The survivors of the Holocaust were treated with contempt by the leaders of the State of Israel, because the survivors, for them, signified a kind of shameful weakness. These are people who went, most of them went to their deaths unresistingly, were too weak to fight back. And that image of the survivor was not something that the leaders of Israel needed at that point, because they had invested in the idea of a very strong, hyper-masculine nation state. So in the beginning, the survivors were badly treated, and then they became hugely important to Israel's identity as a nation that has been built to house the survivors, the refugees from Europe, and then to make sure that the Holocaust never happens again. And how do you do that? By pointing to your neighbors as potential Nazis, which is a process that was started with German assistance during the Eichmann trial, where both German leaders and Israeli leaders collaborated in depicting Arabs and Palestinians as Nazis. For Germany, it was very convenient because they wanted to get rid of the taint that Nazism had left on their country. And so it was very convenient for them to say, the Nazis, the real Nazis, are in Egypt, they are in Jordan, they're in Syria. Obviously, at the same time, there were Nazis in senior positions in the German government. Extremely convenient for the Germans, and also extremely convenient for the Israeli leaders to say, we are surrounded by Nazis, and so we need nuclear weapons. We need to expand. So what is interesting to think that Israelis embraced this narrative of the Holocaust and started to depict themselves as potential victims precisely at the time Israel became the most formidable military power in the Middle East and started to acquire nuclear weapons. It's not that Israel became weaker and as a result resorted to this narrative of victimhood. It was quite the contrary. So it embraced this narrative and then started to justify its expansionism by saying, look, if you don't do this, we will be overwhelmed by these potential Nazis. I mean, the number of times Palestinian leaders are referred to or denounced as Nazis is quite extraordinary. But this rhetoric becomes, central to Israeli legitimacy, as part of the Israeli narrative. And today, of course, you see the most kind of monstrous effects of bringing up generations in a climate of paranoia, bringing up generations with the fear that you're about to be killed, and the people around your country are potential Nazis who are hell-bent upon your extermination. Not people fighting for their rights, people fighting for their dignity, people fighting for their state, but people who are out to kill you because they're all anti-Semites, they're all murderous anti-Semites, genocidal anti-Semites. If you bring up several generations with that fear, you're basically creating people, a generation that will not stop at anything from protecting itself. The survivalist mentality, which is the sort of dominant mentality, which is, mind you, also the mentality of other regimes that have committed these kinds of atrocities. You come to think that you're existentially threatened, and you strike out, you lash out, you fight wars against 4 or 5 countries simultaneously, which is what they are doing right now. So it's a country in the grip of a survivalist mentality, and if you find the source of that survivalist mentality, that is in this narrative of the Holocaust that was very deliberately created.
In the book, you really compellingly track the relationship of Israel of Zionism really to the Shoah through 2 figures, both of them writers, Jean Amery and Primo Levi. Amery, Austrian, Levi, Italian, but otherwise they had a great deal in common. Both were Auschwitz survivors, and both died by suicide by their own hands. Amery in 1978 and Levi in 1987, more or less contemporary with the rise of the Israeli right, of the coup taking power, and this sort of new understanding of the Shoah cementing itself into Israeli identity. I wonder if you could talk a bit about them and track these 2 men who originally had some enthusiasm for Zionism and lately were disgusted and heartbroken by it and rejected by it.
I think those are really crucial figures because, these are people who were both in Auschwitz, managed to survive. Primo Levi went back to Italy, wrote about his experiences, and again, there was so little interest in the Holocaust in those days that, his books were published by a tiny press. He was turned down by Einaudi. And then only much later, when people started to read more about the Holocaust, that he was really discovered. In America, that took a very long time. But then, I think, in the beginning, of course, the survivors of the Holocaust could not but have a very strong attachment to the idea of Israel, even though they did not want to live there. They were happy to go back to where they came from in Europe. But the idea that there is a country that can host these survivors, these refugees, because you have to remember, and that's something I go into at great length in this book, even the countries that won the Second World War was not willing to admit Jewish refugees. Many of them raised their barriers. It's the most extraordinary episode in callousness. And so, I often say, the indifference to Palestinian lives is not unprecedented. There was an equal indifference to Jewish lives back in the 40s and the 1930s. And United States, United Kingdom, France, all these countries which had anti-Semites at the highest levels of their governments, they did not want Jews in their countries. So Israel was an existential necessity at that point. At least that's how it seemed to many of these survivors. And so people like Primo Levi and Jean Amery, they had a very strong attachment to this idea, like here is a place where we can finally live without fear. It's a powerful notion. And then, over time, when it became clear after the 1960s in particular, that Israel was not what they had thought it could be, which was a socialist, progressive, left-leaning country. Mind you, so many people on the left in Europe were attracted to Israel because they thought of it as a egalitarian society, as a socialistic society. People like Jean-Paul Sartre were admirers of the state of Israel, and likewise Jean Amery, Primo Levi thought, well, this is a wonderful opportunity to create a modern socialist society in the Middle East, and there could be models for the countries around them, and they could have good relations with the Arab countries. Soon they became aware that Israel was embarked on a different path altogether, which was an expansion of colonialism and atrocities against Palestinians which were systematized, routinized, such as torture. So Jean-Emery broke his faith when he came across reports of torture of Arab prisoners by Israel. And that's when he wrote one of his last essays, The Limit of Solidarity. Until that time, he was a great defender of Israel, attacking anyone who criticized Israel as an anti-Semite. He was one of the first people to say that people who criticize Zionism are anti-Semites. But then towards the end of his life, he writes an essay saying, the limits of solidarity. If people are being tortured by Israel, then that's where I have to limit my own solidarity with this country. Primo Levi, who lived much longer, Jean-Emery killed himself soon after writing this essay. Primo Levi lived for 12 more years, during which time he witnessed the emergence of this very powerful Holocaust narrative that we are talking about, and the cult of the survivor. As I said, the survivors were not taken, with any great, were not treated with any great respect early on. It was only from the 70s and 80s onwards that they started to become, important, prominent figures. And Primo Levi became very uneasy with this cult of the survivor. He often said that, people think the survivors have great truths to tell about their experience, but it's not the survivors. It's the people who were killed who had those great truths to impart, and they are now dead. And then he went to America. Before he goes to America, he hears about the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Until that point, he's becoming extremely suspicious of the far right emerging in Israel. He's already critical of Israel, and then the 82 massacres happen. He's on a visit to Auschwitz at that time. He's really extremely troubled by this. He comes back to Italy, joins various demonstrations, writes open letters, including with other Italian Jewish writers, and becomes really quite a strong critic of the state of Israel, while at the same time expressing his solidarity with it, but increasingly wondering what's going on here. This is not the state that I thought, I could support. Then he goes to America, and at that point, America is in the midst of this discovery of the Holocaust, which is later then, institutionalized in films, in museums, in movies of all kinds. And Primo Levi realizes that he's being wheeled out to New York to audiences as the Jewish survivor. And he's very uneasy with all this. He doesn't want to be identified as a Jew. He says, I'm a writer, I'm an Italian, I'm a chemist. The Jewish part of my identity is not that important to me. But there he is, he's being, put on a pedestal. And then when he starts to criticize Israel, the audience is shocked. There's a horrible magazine called Commentary, which commissions a young writer to write an attack on him. She writes this attack. She, by the way, is extremely regretful that she did that. It's an attack on Primo Levi, basically saying he's not Jewish enough because he doesn't support Israel in the way he should. And Primo Levi goes back. He's really broken by this. He goes back and he tells a friend of his that article, among other things, extinguished his will to live. And soon after that, he commits suicide. So you're looking at, this extraordinary kind of bizarre cult of Holocaust memory that is disrespectful of actual survivors, that is so invested in the protection and defense of Israel that it can, trample someone like Primo Levi's reputation. So I think, and mind you, Primo Levi was only a witness to the sort of early stages of the deterioration in Israeli politics. If he had seen what is happening today, he would have gone mad out of grief. And there are, other people I talk about in the book who were also survivors and refugees, who were also, equally shocked by what they saw. Today's grisly spectacle is something, just on a different scale altogether.
Yeah, I think you cite a few times Marek Edelman, who was the leader of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, who was an anti-Zionist. and who's virtually unknown in the English-speaking world, and even Primo Levi in the Anglophone world is not particularly well known, whereas Elie Wiesel, who fits the Zionist narrative, has achieved a sort of sanctity. I want to ask you about a parallel development that you trace out in the United States, it kind of helps to look back at that year, 1982, after the Israeli occupation of Lebanon began, when Ronald Reagan criticized Menachem Begin, the Israeli premier, and for having perpetrated a, quote, Holocaust in Lebanon, and telling him to stop it. And this is almost unthinkable now, that an American president would use such language, not only use such language, but actually demand action and demand an end to the aggression by Israel. And I wonder if you can trace out a bit for us, like, what has changed? Why is that? How has the Shoah also come to occupy a different place in the American imagination, and why has that become so unthinkable? I mean, Ronald Reagan was hardly a anti-colonial figure.
No, I mean, it's fascinating, Ben. I mean, you know so much about it, but I think it comes as a great sort of revelation to a lot of people to realize that, again, even Jewish Americans were not interested, were not really writing about the Holocaust to the same extent that it was written about in recent decades. 50s, 60s, the major Jewish writers, Saul Bellow, Norman Mailer, Philip Roth, these were people almost entirely indifferent to this side of, this part of European history. Came to write about it very late in their writing careers, when the Holocaust had already acquired a central place in American memory cultures. So the incorporation of the Holocaust into American cultural memory is a very late development. It happened in my lifetime. The construction of the Holocaust Museum, the making of Schindler's List, and then, of course, whole kind of sort of really a sort of industry of books, cinema, movies, all kinds of plays, various narratives that had gone out of print a long time ago. And then accompanying this effort is also political consolidation, a very organized investment in American politics on the part of lobby groups, powerful organizations with, connections to every major American politician. I mean, someone like Joe Biden. Joe Biden's sort of investments in Zionism may have something to do with growing up with a father who told him to always protect Jews, but it also has a great deal to do with the fact that he received more money from Israel lobby groups than almost any politician in the United States. So there is that kind of connection that is forged between American politicians and the State of Israel. There's a Christian evangelist lobby that emerges around the same time that has this crazy idea that Armageddon is going to happen in Israel, and therefore we should support the State of Israel so as to bring it about faster. And then I think business links, of course, but really extremely important is the Jewish American attachment to Israel, which again, we might assume is a natural kind of connection, ancestral connection, but I think, it is something of relatively recent vintage. And again, you can explain it by looking at other immigrant communities in America who also feel a very strong ancestral connection with India. I mean, in India, for instance, in India, we deal with overseas Hindus living in places like the United States, supporting far-right personalities and movements in India while sitting in America, funding them, setting up local organizations, local lobby groups. So we have to deal in India with these efforts by Hindu Americans to create these big far-right organizations. And why are they doing that? Because this is the way in which they can fill the secular void in their lives with some meaning. This is a society that demands of you that, you basically give up all kinds of beliefs in your tradition and your religion, and join the pursuit of success, join the pursuit of money. You do that for a while, and then you become aware of these big, sort of voids in your life, big gaps, big large sort of source of meaninglessness in your life. And one way in which you recreate that meaning is by connecting yourself to your ancestral heritage. There are other examples of that, the Irish being another one, supporting Irish nationalism from afar. But I think the Jewish-American connection with Israel has been the most consequential of these immigrant communities' sort of links with their ancestry, because it has, to a large extent, shaped both domestic policy and the foreign policy of the United States, which is an extraordinary thing when you think about it. I mean, today, the United States under Trump's government is essentially destroying some of the most cherished principles of American society because of this pressure that anyone who criticizes Israel has to be punished, has to be suppressed. So the support, in other words, for Israel amongst the American political class has reached a point where it is actually destroying the American Constitution. Some of, the First Amendment is under threat. So this is really, I don't think the story has been properly told, but it's, historians will look back and marvel at this. Like, how did this happen? How did a small country in the Middle East acquire such an extraordinary political, emotional, spiritual hold over the most powerful country in the world? And you can really only explain it by exploring all these different connections, the political connection, the emotional investments, the culture industry. But, we are really looking at the more kind of destructive consequences of that emotional attachment.
If we have time, I want to circle back to an even more twisted kind of attachment, which is you discussed Germany's very strange relationship to Israel. But before we do that, and I wanted to go farther afield, which is in the third section of the book, you leave behind Europe and the U.S. To talk about this major world historical event, which has completely transformed the globe in the quarter century after the Second World War, which is decolonization, which is I think you call it an unparalleled revolutionary reversal and the central event of the 20th century for an overwhelming majority of the human population. One that Western elites, nonetheless, find it impossible to even see, for the most part, to this day. Particularly in the Anglophone world, but I think throughout Europe, this is this major shift has to be either denied or actively combated, which is, I think, a lot of what we're seeing in the rise of the far right, both in Europe and the U.S. But before we get there, this major revolutionary change occurred at basically the same time, within a few years, as the foundation of the Jewish state, right? So this is the context into which Israel is born, as this strangely anachronistic outpost of Europe, a colonial force in a world that was suddenly very swiftly and forcefully decolonizing. So I wonder if you could first start by talking a bit about this major shift, decolonization generally, and secondly, if you can put Israel a bit into this context, which I think helps us to understand some of the power dynamics that we've been talking about so far.
I think it might be useful to remember that a lot of people who were fighting for liberation from Western empires in Asia and Africa in the early 20th century, insofar as they were aware of Zionism, they were actually quite sympathetic to it, because they saw Zionism as a perfectly legitimate demand on the part of a persecuted people, the European Jews, for a homeland where they could live in freedom and dignity. That's a demand that the Asian Africans were themselves making. So they were sympathetic to it. Nehru was sympathetic to it. Sun Yat-sen in China, Gandhi, then so many statements. One caveat they always had, which was, the Jews have a right to national self-determination. They have a right to their homeland. But please don't do it with the help of Western arms. Please don't impose yourself on an Arab population with the help of British imperialists or any Western imperialists. And why was that? Because these people had already spent decades fighting for liberation from a racist imperialism. They did not want that racist imperialism to have an outpost in the heart of the Middle East. Again, to go back a little bit even further, I think, why were they fighting racist imperialism? Why did the best people in places like South Asia spend their lives, so much of their lives, in prison? Because they grew up in a world which was determined by white racial privilege. And that's something they knew they had to uproot before they could aspire to any other kind of equality. They all wanted equality, but the language in which they first phrased that aspiration was an end to racial inequality. So whether it's Japan, which was a modern state which fought on the side of the European powers in the First World War, wanted racial equality, did not get it, and then became an imperialist power in the Second World War, attacking various European empires. The thirst, the passion for racial equality was dominant in the anti-colonial struggle. And so the idea that European Jews will come to the Middle East with the help of British imperialists was anathema to even people who were sympathetic to Zionism in the first part of the 20th century. So after that, after the State of Israel comes into existence, hardly any Asian or African state establishes diplomatic relations with it, because they see it very clearly as an imposition on the Middle East with the help of Western arms. And mind you, at that time, even the Soviet Union under Stalin is supporting the Zionists. And the communist parties of Western Europe are doing the same. So from that point onwards, I think, you chose that moment in the late 40s, decolonization begins, the State of Israel comes into existence. From that very moment, you have these, divergent narratives. One narrative is that decolonization is an unstoppable force because it is powered by the thirst for equality. And equality is a revolutionary sentiment. It will never be eradicated. And so you cannot stop decolonization. At the same time, you have decolonization being reversed by a state supplied by Western powers. So that conflict has really only grown over the years. In the initial phases, Israel tried to make good relations with Asian and African countries. They thought, these are rising powers, these will be very important, China and various African countries and Asian countries, including India. So let's build good relations with them. But I think the inner logic of their politics was expansion. And at some point, expansion and the need to take American support, the need to take support from the apartheid regime in South Africa, that was not going to make you friends in Africa. And that, those relations with African countries fell apart completely after that. And, by the mid-70s, you have major Asian powers like China, India, Indonesia at the United Nations saying Zionism is a form of racial discrimination. So I think there was a kind of broad consensus that this is a form of racist imperialism imported into this part of the world. And as I said, this was there from the very beginning. This sort of suspicion that the plan for a Jewish homeland would be achieved at the expense of Palestinians and be achieved through violent means. And this we will not accept. So today, if South Africa goes to the ICJ, and files a case against Israel, there is so much to lose for South Africa. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why would it do it? Because there is a principle at play here. And they would risk a lot for the sake of that principle. And that principle is of equality and dignity and freedom for the non-white peoples of the world.
There's a point towards the end of the book where you've laid out these two sort of competing narratives, the Zionist narrative and this narrative of decolonization. And I think this was, for me, the sort of most exciting and brilliant contribution of the book, which you then complicate both of these sort of competing narratives by explicating the degree to which the impulse that lay behind Zionism, which was to pull a marginalized and oppressed people out of the insecurity that they have been subjected to historically, unfortunately at the expense of another marginalized people, but that this was one that people throughout the global South could actually relate to quite strongly. And this, I think, gets to the heart of a tragedy that is often difficult to see in this. That there, as much as Zionism is clearly a completely compromised and at this point, I think, corrupt force in the world, that there was somewhere in the past century, there was an impulse towards equality, towards throwing off the oppression of the centuries, which did have appeal, among others, to you as a kid. And you refer a few times in the book to this curious fact that you grew up with a poster of Moshe Dayan on your wall, and that your grandfather was among a curious species of upper caste Hindu nationalist who could both admire the Zionists and admire Hitler. And I wonder if you can kind of like thread the needle through some of those contradictions and.
Yeah, I think we have to kind of, in a way, recover some of those ideas. I feel, one reason why I wrote that.
Not the admiration of Hitler part.
The what?
Not the admiration of Hitler.
Not the admiration of Hitler, but I feel like with these antagonistic narratives, we are not going to make any political progress. So I think there is wisdom in seeing the last 150 years as a history of violence, which had many victims, including the Jewish population of Israel, and colonized peoples in Asia, Africa, Latin America. The question I'm trying to pose: is there a way to see this violence as indivisible, or do we draw certain narratives that serve us and exclude others, that benefit us but harm others, which is the case with many of these, nationalist narratives, whether it's Hindu nationalism or Zionism, because if we don't look at this history in this way, we will always be playing a zero-sum game here. When people say today, rightly, horrified and angry over what is being done to the Palestinians, that Zionism is a dead end and that we must dismantle Zionism, you can understand their anger, but at the same time, Israel is a reality. Israel is a reality, and that reality will persist for a long time, no matter what its state, what its internal weaknesses are. Now, do we want a Palestinian state to exist alongside Israel, which is, the one solution that at this point looks like the one that can guarantee, life of freedom and dignity for many Palestinians who otherwise are going to be dispossessed? Or do we imagine a future in which, Palestinians take over what is now Israel, which would amount to ethnic cleansing, which will have to amount to ethnic cleansing? What I'm trying to say is that there are these antagonistic narratives which are determined upon not acknowledging the other. And, even though it's difficult to argue that in these circumstances, but I think we should try and make an effort to see how the experience of weaker peoples throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, how that has led them to certain dead ends. And that in order to get out of those dead ends, we need to think differently about the past. Get away from memory cultures, whether of the Holocaust or of colonialism, because that's not going to help us chart our way into the future. That is going to actually hold us back from coming up with political solutions to these problems. They're going to only increase antagonism and feelings of enmity. Again, it's a very difficult thing to say to people who are being victimized, who are being subject to horrific violence, and I will never say that to them, but I'm thinking for the rest of us who are not directly being victimized by the violence there, who have an opportunity to think about this more broadly, reflect on this more broadly. We should be coming up with narratives that are not antagonistic. Otherwise, we are going to end up with a situation that we are looking at in the United States, in Germany, in Israel, where one side is hell-bent upon completely suppressing this other narrative and will do everything, whatever it takes. Now, I think the answer to that is not to say that my narrative is superior to yours, but it is to say that, look, this is a larger history of suffering and a kind of history of violence that has traumatized so many of us for such a long time, that has created such massive distortions in our individual and collective psyches. We need to address these issues and not really think in ways that will further these antagonisms. So I think, I feel in that context, looking at Jewish history together with the history of colonized peoples is a really important step, because Jewish people in Europe and Eastern Europe particularly, and in what is now Russia, was once the Soviet Union, were viciously persecuted, were again told the same things that people in Asia and Africa heard, that they were parasites, they bred too much, they were weak, they were cowardly. And unless we understand that, understand that history, we won't understand Zionism, we won't understand Hindu nationalism either. All these nationalisms and all these ideologies have to be connected to this early history of persecution, without again saying that this is my history, and this makes me special and this entitles me to unleash, unprecedented violence against my enemies. But to see how these histories are connected, and what are we actually victims of here?
Yeah, I think there's a sort of squint your eyes reading this book. What remains clear are these people trying in various ways to pull meaning out of just enormous trauma and suffering, and doing so in ways that ultimately creates, again, far more trauma and suffering. And I think if we can understand many of the kind of great ideologies of modernity, and the not so great ones as well, as attempts to kind of find some final way out of this sort of boulder rolling down a hill, and of violence upon violence upon violence, and to try to create some kind of final safety, either whether it's in a certain place or in time, and one of the things you're showing is the failure of all of these attempts. And I wonder, just as a last question before we open up to questions from the audience, here we are in the ruins, and this book is very much tracking the creation of those ruins, of these various dreams of modernity, Zionism, various other forms of nationalism, to create some safe space for one or another peoples, and they all fail, But what also fails, and I think this is one of the places we started, is liberal humanism, right? Is that this dream that rationality and reason will also get us to some kind of like utopian progression towards a better world. That also, we're seeing all of the hypocrisy and failures of that. So where are we in the ruins? How do we live here? Sorry for that question. I think I feel that we've certainly come to a end of an experiment here, which was the experiment, as you say, in rationalism, in the assumption that human beings are rational individuals who are pursuing their interests and working together with other individuals, and somehow those interests coincide. I think it's become clear that these are kind of fantasies. These are stories we've told ourselves, and that as human beings, we are far more flawed than we like to think, that we are not at all immune to some of the most disturbing, dark emotions and sentiments. The best of us are like that. And that political institutions carry these human imperfections. And especially the institutions of nationalism, which magnify some of our worst tendencies, which is the suspicion of others, hostility towards others. Nationalism is almost built upon, defining the enemy, creating national unity on the basis of defining the other. And if we don't break free of that, and nationalism is the dominant political institution of modernity, if we don't break free of that and contemplate a world that is increasingly knit together by technology, by communications, digital communications, where we face challenges that are truly global in scope, whether it's AI or climate change, where we need global cooperation, we need global institutions that can coordinate human efforts, across different parts of the world. Nationalism, not just Zionism, is a terribly ill-suited ideology, and yet that is what people are retreating into right now. But at the same time, just because nationalism is flourishing against a far-right version of it doesn't say anything about its efficacy. It's just a very dangerous idea at this point, especially when we need much more global cooperation. So I would say, look, this is an opportunity to actually really reflect on this impasse that we've been brought to. And I think, last sort of 18 months of continuous violence with no end in sight. And then, of course, the chaos unleashed by Donald Trump and the resurgence of, various far-right groups in Europe and elsewhere. This is an extraordinary moment. And again, a kind of moment that I hope will be as rewarding as a period after the First World War, where people really did think again about the modern systems that had unleashed this kind of violence that nobody could stop. And, obviously that didn't stop the Second World War from happening, but at least there was an attempt to think about different kinds of political institutions, federations, shared sovereignty, various ideas that emerged, global governance. I think it's long been time to think seriously about those kinds of institutions and practices, because right now this is a total dead end. This is really, at this point, the existing institutions, existing ideologies are just taking us deeper and deeper into this abyss. Well, thank you, Pankaj.
Not helpful
for that. I wouldn't be any more sunny about it myself. But let's open up to questions. Is there anyone from the audience who has anything on their mind? Yes.
Thank you both for such an amazing talk and discussion. I have two very quick questions for both of you, actually. I was wondering about what your thoughts were about maybe the lessons we can draw from post-apartheid South Africa in the light of what's happening right now. If there are any lessons we can learn from their process of reconciliation, etc. I don't know, not sure, but just to ask you to develop that. And the second question, very quickly, is whatever happened to pacifism, and can we kind of bring it back to life? And I mean, it's an outdated notion, outdated movement, but I was wondering if you could put it in the context of today's discussions. I think it's kind of valuable to think about it, because we've lost touch of that idea of pacifism.
I would say the only person who is talking about pacifism is Pope Francis. You know, the only major world leader to warn of the dangers of militarism and to insist that war is not at all a solution. It's a pathology. I think there are so many traditions we've lost sight of. There was a very strong pacifist tradition in America, often religious communities, also in Europe, also in different parts of the world, conscientious objectors in both the Second World Wars. We have less and less evidence of that tradition today. I mean, I don't know what will revive that particular tradition. South Africa, I think it was a really extraordinary experiment in reconciling former enemies in South Africa. I think a lot of people have been extremely critical of it because it seemed to give too much power at the end of it to the supposed persecutors, the white majority, the white minority in South Africa. But at the same time, I think it's easy to imagine South Africa kind of collapsing into a kind of violence, a kind of vengeful violence, without the truth and reconciliation efforts. And there were some very distinguished people involved with that. Again, people with sort of profound sense of just how these things work out in individual lives and collective lives. That if you don't forgive, if you're not compassionate, if you are vengeful, then the cycle of violence will continue, and it will be ultimately destructive. So I think the South Africa case is really, really instructive in many ways, despite all its flaws. Ben might have a different view of that.
No, yeah, I'm not as. I think all I would say is that the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, I think there are obvious flaws to it. The main one that I'm aware of is that the economic power remained in the same hands. But I think what's quite extraordinary about it was that there was a process. I mean, Spain hasn't had a truth and reconciliation process. That there are massive injustices everywhere in the world that have not had this kind of frontal attempt to work through things. And I think to that degree, it's an inspiration, even if a flawed one. About pacifism, I think I may not give you the answer you want, which is, I tend to think about this in terms of the endless calls on Palestinians to be more nonviolent, and which we see where this has led. I think one of the things that makes it hard to talk about pacifism in the moment is who has all the guns. And as an American, I know who has the guns there. And I'm not entirely comfortable with being a pacifist for that reason. Yes, sir.
So we talked about the South African model. The other model that perhaps comes to mind also is the Irish, Northern Ireland model, where essentially you had an intractable conflict for more than a century, actually, and somehow led to a reconciliation. Looking at that model, do you see any parallel? Because at the end of the day, I think taking a step back and perhaps wearing a positive or trying to wear a hopeful hat, if we were to change the paradigm of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where would that change come from? Is it grassroots? Is it politicians? Is it student movements? Is it the United States only? Is it the Arab states? And how can we shape sort of a different narrative to lead to begin to think about perhaps reconciliation? And could the Irish model, for example, offer a good example on how to approach that? But for that model to work, there are certain variables that would have to be looked at to really begin to come up with a, not necessarily a solution, but at least to embrace, sort of embark on a path that could lead to a solution in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, but somehow change the narrative. Thank you.
I think there's, there has to be political will for any of this to happen. And where will it come from right now? Definitely not the United States or Western Europe. Internally, within Israeli society, it's hard to imagine which section of the population will advance this process or even propose it without being shut down. I think it's not up to the Palestinians to do this. So it has to come from the people who are overwhelmingly dominant and powerful, who have, as Ben put it, have all the guns, most of the guns. It's again. I think definitely we should be thinking about this and thinking about these kinds of paradigms. The most important thing is to think about paradigms that do not perpetuate this cycle of violence, where victims turn into perpetrators, and then all over again, and to arrive at solutions that are kind of acceptable, however flawed they are, however imperfect they are, make for a modicum of peace and stability in the region. So one has to constantly think politically about this. One has to think about what can happen here in the future. That's what I mean by thinking politically about it. Is there a prospect? What are the prospects for peace and stability? Because although I agree with Ben about the question of pacifism takes on a different complexion when you talk about defenseless Palestinians who are living in an open-air prison camp.
I wouldn't say defenseless,
but certainly not people with armed and provisioned by the most powerful countries on earth. And I think people insisting that they resort to non-violence is an unreasonable demand and a presumptuous demand. At the same time, we know that force is not going to solve this problem, and that force used against Israel simply feeds into the Israeli narrative that these people are potential Nazis, they're about to kill us all, and that we are justified in taking whatever steps we are taking right now. So again, I think, violence also creates this kind of deadlock and these kinds of mentalities, which become unbreakable and remain unbreakable over several generations, which seems to be the case now. Even the Israeli intelligentsia, which used to be vocal in the past, has fallen silent. You don't hear from Israeli writers, intellectuals, protesting against the behavior of their leaders. Not a word, unless you're aware of this, unless there are people who are saying these things and I'm just not aware of them.
Well, they'll protest against Netanyahu's internal power grabs, but not against the treatment of Palestinians. I think there's wide consent for that. Julie.
I want to tell a nasty story, so please bear with me for a moment. We have the genocide in Gaza in our faces every day. We're seeing people collecting pieces of their children in plastic bags, and we have to try and digest what's happening there. But there's another genocide that's happening in the world that probably nobody or very few people in this room will know about, and that is West Papua. And that has been going on for 60 years. and about 25% of the population has been murdered, but we do not know because Indonesia, which occupies the country, is not keeping statistics of this. But this goes back to the, this is not something that was happening very secretly, because the international so-called community knew about it. In fact, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, was murdered, along with 15 other members of the United Nations. And it seems from documents that were obtained by Desmond Tutu in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, that it was a lot to do with Congo and the succession of Katanga and its minerals, but more to do with Dag Hammarskjöld's attempts to democratise the United Nations by decolonising up to 49 countries to try and stop the stagnation that was caused by the two big powers. Okay, this has been a systematic cover-up. So what happens with this genocide in West Papua? It's a crime against humanity, but a crime against humanity is a crime against all humanity. And in particular, in the case of West Papua, where this genocide is actually ecocide, because the rainforest is being chopped down, and this has effects on everybody. So how do we deal with this, a genocide, an ecocide that is not known about, where the international institutions are covering up and have covered up for 60 years, where the president of Indonesia is a war criminal, Prabowo Subianto, who was responsible for the deaths of about 30% of the population of Timor? I think the only way we can try and confront this is to go back to the only transversal narrative we have, which is universal human rights, and try to reclaim them from the base. Now, of course, this is not an easy project, and maybe I'm being utopian in even mentioning it. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. I agree.
In the back?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just want to note, we've had an hour and 15 minutes and there's been no mention of October 7th. Does that mean you find it an irrelevant or inconsequential point to this debate? Second point is just this question about Zionism. I want to push you on that, which has meant something different to my grandparents in the 1930s, to Yitzhak Rabin, and something very, very different now with Ben Gvir and Netanyahu. I want to know, do you think that the term has changed in its meaning and its importance in the debate with the Israel-Palestine conflict, or do you? And partly because of what you said at the end, you said that Israel is here to stay. Everyone, or certainly a vast majority of Israelis are Zionists, and therefore is using that term as not necessarily a term of insult, but a term of criticism. Is that a problem?
Is that a problem for
the debate?
I mean, it may be a problem for the debate, but I think, there is the geopolitical reality of a country that has 8 million people who have been living there for nearly 80 years. We've created a society, institutions. I mean, no matter how violently opposed you are to the state of Israel, you cannot possibly be wanting its eradication. That's another kind of murderous project, So I think the solution would be for Israel to create conditions in its own society and in the neighborhood that allows it to live in peace with its neighbors. It refuses to do so. We have to ask ourselves the question, why? Why is it so invested in expansion? Why is it so intoxicated with fantasies of expansion? Why does it want to be in continuous, state of war with several of its neighbors, including, other countries?
Just literally, that's the point. Yitzhak Rabin wasn't in
Sorry, can you repeat that? Yeah.
Just on that expansion point, I don't believe Yitzhak Rabin was on the same page as Netanyahu is today on expansion. I think they were actually kind of very much going in different directions, and that's part of why we're where we are today, is that ended that process.
I think it's possible to believe that there were people within the Israeli establishment, they were not in favor of this kind of expansion. And not only Rabin, there were others. But I think we have to look at who actually won that battle within the Israeli establishment. Over time, it's the far right, it's the expansionist right that has been winning that particular argument. And unless that expansion stops and is reversed to a great extent, Israel is not going to have peace in the neighborhood. You can't kill all those millions of Palestinians. You have to learn to live with them in peace and guarantee that they live in freedom and dignity. Only then, as people have said a million times, only then can Israel flourish. Otherwise, it remains a country in a state of war. I think the first question, October 7, is something that, I tend to write about things that have not been mostly written about, that have not been explored. October 7 is one day that has been extensively written about in the Western media, in the Western press. It's been covered extensively. I feel like I have nothing more to add to it except to say that it was a traumatic event. It was a day of enormous violence of the kind that Israel had not suffered before. And it was a traumatic event for the Israeli population and for many people around the world who feel connected, attached through relations or just emotionally attached to the state of Israel. And that I've already, in a way that's almost kind of assumed, because there is already, as I said, there's just so much writing about that connection, about the importance of that day. And I think, unfortunately, when you think about how the Israelis themselves responded to October 7, they did not even wait for some of the worst atrocity stories to emerge from that day. There were some horrific things that happened on that day. And the world did not even have the chance to absorb those stories and to learn about Israeli suffering on that day. The very same day, they started blowing up buildings in Gaza. So the whole narrative from that point shifted, and we were all focused on what was happening to Gaza from that point onwards. So if October 7 is not sufficiently covered, in your view and the views of many other people, is because the Israelis themselves did not actually allow the events of that day to resonate. Instead, they came forward with propaganda stories which were exposed as completely false very soon afterwards, about beheaded babies, compromising several political leaders who bought those stories. So it was a in a way, they themselves sort of ensured that October 7 will not be talked about much by following it up with, days and weeks and months and now years of continuous atrocity.
Yeah, I think I'd have that. Talking about October 7th became, in a very twisted way, a way of not talking about the 50,000 plus deaths that have occurred in Gaza. This was true from the very beginning, that if anyone attempted to speak critically about Israel's actions in Gaza, the first thing you were asked is, but do you condemn the events of October 7th? But do you condemn? But do you condemn? And the question in reverse was never allowed to be asked and still isn't. So anyway, anyone else? Yes, in the back there.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much for this extremely illuminating and instructive conversation. My name is Milisu Tando, and I didn't plan to speak today because I'm just a guest. I just arrived this morning, but I'm South African, so I thought, let me say something. So I was born in apartheid, South Africa, but I was 8 years old when it ended and grew up in Nelson Mandela's South Africa, Desmond Tutu South Africa, the one we know and praise today. But I was born in a place called the Republic of Transkei, which does not exist anymore. It was a homeland state that was invented by the apartheid regime in 1976 to bring to fruition this idea of racial separation. And it was rubbished by the whole entire world. There were black leaders and a black government, black laws, and I grew up for the first 9 years of my life in an all Pan-African state where there were no white people in my life, and I felt safe, but it was all bought by the regime of apartheid. And the only two countries that recognized the Republic of Transkei were South Africa and Israel. And Israel was the only country that attended the inauguration of the Transkei president in 1996. It was the only country that funded the building of irrigation systems and small towns. And my father, when I was a child, we grew up with a photo album of his trip to Israel. And the context in which this was explained to us was that, you know, he went there to touch Jesus' grave. And so we grew up with this narrative of pride. He went to touch Jesus' grave. And it was only much later, in the last 2 years, that I learned that actually there were some state trips that the Transkei and Israeli people used to take back and forth, cultural trips, trade trips, all kinds of things. And he went with a group of people to buy an aloe medicine plant that people gave, you know, that drank for health, all kinds of health issues. And we were not taught this in South African history. I made a film about it that's playing tomorrow night. But the thing that I wanted to say in response to what was happening, this conversation today, was that the Truth and Reconciliation and South Africa's, or the ANC and PAC and the black people's response to apartheid was not merely a political thing. It was also very much informed by the cultural values and the indigenous knowledge systems and who we are as a people. Apartheid and colonialism made us into black people, but when we entered into those spaces, or when they encountered us, we were not just black people. We were human beings who had our own knowledge systems about what it means to be human, what are our principles for how to forgive and why to forgive. And it wasn't about just human rights. We weren't fighting for the human rights to swim in swimming pools with white people or to go to the same schools. That's not why apartheid ended. Apartheid ended because it was informed by an antithetical knowledge system to this notion that we must be separated, which is what apartheid is built on. Apartheid is built on fascism and this idea that we must build fences of difference between us. And the knowledge system that informed the end of apartheid and the thing that kept us together, that's still keeping us together, even though by a thread, because South Africa is extremely imperfect, is this idea that there's no such thing as an individual. And Ubuntu means whatever happens to me, whatever I say about you, I'm actually saying about myself. Whatever I do to you, I am ordering harm to come to myself. And so this is the thing that informs the Truth and Reconciliation and the coming together of cultural institutions together with political institutions, together with civic institutions, and the ways in which we are looking at the issues of the world today, we're almost overburdening our political institutions with coming up with answers for how to resolve this. I know that many of us are angry with our religious institutions and we've thrown the baby out of the bathwater, but Desmond Tutu is a religious person. And those people have something to share. The civic institutions and cultural institutions like this one have something to contribute to how to think ourselves out of this thing. We can no longer overburden and think the politicians are going to get us out of this. They're not. It's about what are the knowledge systems of Catalonia. What are the ancient knowledge systems? How did the people here conceive of how to exist with nature, with themselves? How do we eat? How do we gather? How do we say good morning? How do we say good evening? It's those things, and wherever we are in the world, it is time for us to do our deep homework to figure out who are we and who were we, because the colony destroyed everything in its path. And the only way to get out is to bring various forces together. And as much as South Africa is imperfect, and we also are forgetting this beauty of Ubuntu and Isintu as these knowledge systems, and at least we were hanging by the thread, because in my lifetime, I have a memory of how incredibly amazing it was to grow up under leaders who told us they loved us and us believing them because they did. And this love wasn't a messaging, it was informed by the love of humanity that the people of my country and my continent have and have not lost. And today we are inviting the rest of the world to say, remember who you are. Do the deep homework to remember who were we before we were separated by ethnicity, race, gender, borders, all of these things. And it's when we tap into that thing that we will all remember that actually we are much more similar than we are different, and that we desperately miss each other. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Pankaj. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you all for being here. Pankaj will stay to sign books if anyone has books they'd like signed. And thank you all very much.